Hello, and welcome to Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews, brought to you by the Sci-Fi Christian.com. I'm Ben DiBono, and I have finally finished my reread of The Odyssey. So, a few months ago, I did a review of the Iliad after slowly rereading that one over several months. And I've just finished The Odyssey a few days ago. So, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Homer's incredible poem, incredible follow-up to the Iliad. And really just a masterful work. You don't need me to tell you that, of course. It's one of the classics of Western civilization, one of the great pieces of art ever created. But I have some thoughts I want to throw into the 3,000-year history of discussion of the Odyssey. Yeah, right, whatever I can add, but, here it goes. So what struck me in this book, as I was reading it this time, is where the emphasis often lies when we talk about the Odyssey, okay? So here's what I'm talking about. A lot of times, if I was to ask, random people to name events in the Odyssey, assuming they actually have enough knowledge of the poem to know what I'm talking about, I think most people would list off things like the Sirens and the Cyclops and the Journey into Hades and all of that. Some of the more wild, supernatural monster elements that are about Odysseus' journey back to Ithaca. Indeed, the very term Odyssey, the name Odyssey has become a term to mean long, epic journey. So our focus when we, at least from my perspective, and I'll freely admit, have not delved into scholarship of this book. But from a casual perspective, as somebody who loves Homer, who pays attention to when I hear or read comments about the Odyssey coming up, it seems to me that a lot of times the emphasis is on Odysseus' journey. In fact, it was interesting because on the Sci-Fi Christian website, one of our new writers, Adam Pratt, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right now, Adam. I know I've butchered your last name in the past, and I apologize for that. But Adam Pratt and I just did a series called the Sci-Fi Christian Classroom, where on Coursea.org or .com or something like that, they offer these free online courses, and we did a course together that was kind of a MMOs, video games, fantasy type study. And they brought up the poem Ithaca, and I forget who it's by. And I apologize for that. I probably should have gotten the name before I sat down to do the review. But this poem Ithaca, which focuses on how it's more about the journey than it is the destination. Okay, and that right there has become a cliche within our culture. It's about the journey, not the destination. And this poem really, really went after that. And the class that we were taking made that same point, that, when it comes to video games, when it comes to fantasy, it's about the journey, not the destination. Well, after rereading the Odyssey, I respectfully disagree. This is a story not about the journey. The journey's important, but what matters is Ithaca. Look at the amount of space devoted to Ithaca. It's nearly half the novel. Probably more than half if we take this stuff at the beginning, before we even get to Odysseus' story. And Odysseus relates most of those events in the form of flashback narratives, where he's telling somebody about what happened to him. This is not the story of a man coming home from war. This is a story about what happens to him when he gets home. And yes, we spend some time getting him there, but that's not what the novel's about, the poem is about. It's about what happens when he gets to Ithaca and confronts the suitors. And that to me is a very interesting and powerful way to think about this poem. And one I haven't heard a lot about. So as I probably mentioned before, I've done a lot of study back before I became a Catholic and I was working as an associate pastor at a Baptist church. I did a lot of work with men in the church, so studying masculinity, studying masculine initiation in particular. And among that, studying some of Joseph Campbell's stuff on the monomyth and some of the psychological initiation stuff that's been written on that. And Campbell describes this kind of three phase of the hero's journey that's reflected in masculine initiation rites historically, of departure from the culture, ordeal, the time of testing and trying, and then return of reestablishment within the culture as a fully initiated man in the context of masculine initiation, or the context of a conquering hero or heroine. What does it mean when the warrior returns to his home as a fundamentally different person than he was before he left, due to whatever went on in that middle ordeal phase? So we think about that with Odysseus. We clearly have leaving to war, the departure stage, which we never really see in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then we have a lot with the ordeal stage, his 10 or so years fighting in the Trojan War, and then some of his journeys back home. But the Odyssey is more concerned with the return stage of the hero's journey than anything else. And that's a really important thing, I think, because when it comes to the hero's journey, and when it comes to how we think about transformation as it parallels that process, how we think about masculine initiation as it parallels that process, the return stage often kind of gets the shaft. I think of a movie like Star Wars, very carefully planned on the hero's journey. Luke, the climax of Luke's ordeal is taking down the Death Star, and then we get to the return phase. It's condensed to basically him jumping out of his X-Wing, hugging Leia, and then cutting to awards ceremony. So the return stage isn't very much. The Matrix, another movie that is very much intentionally, a lot of movies are like this, but intentionally patterned on Campbell's monomyth. Climax of Neo's ordeal is his fighting with Agent Smith and then overcoming them at the end, stopping the bullets and what have you. And his return phase is the phone call he makes at the end of the movie. So that stage, which I think is very important in the hero's journey, doesn't get a lot of airtime, if you will, when it comes to how we think about transformation. And so I think that it would be more helpful if we looked at the Odyssey not as look at all the cool stuff that happens to Odysseus on his way back to Ithaca, but look at what that return stage is about for Odysseus. To me, that's what Homer's really trying to explore here, is what happens to Odysseus when he gets back to Ithaca, and most importantly, why does it matter? And there's a sense that when you come back from the hero's journey, you don't just step back into your old life. There is a process of reestablishing yourself. That is the return phase, represented by Odysseus' confrontation with the suitors, his slowly revealing himself to those in Ithaca, his convincing them of who he is. And that's really important, and that's what Homer spends the bulk of this poem on. Not the Cyclops, not the descent into Hades, not the Sirens, not that we want to discard those events, but that's not ultimately the thrust of the story. So to people who have focused on the Odyssey as a journey, I respectfully disagree. Not in the sense where I want to discard those elements, but I simply don't agree that that is what the poem is about. I think it's about Odysseus' return, and I think if we spent more time focusing on that part of what Homer says, we'd uncover some pretty powerful stuff that maybe most reflections on this poem have neglected or forgotten or minimized. So those are my 2 cents on the Odyssey. Obviously, it's wonderful. You don't need me to tell you that. If you haven't read it, read it. If you have read it, read it again. It's one of those great experiences of Western culture that we should all indulge in, and likely indulge in more than once. So, that's all for now. I'm Ben DiBono, and this is the Sci-Fi Christian Book Reviews.